So we're going to start over for the very few of those that aren't here. Real quick, like, so bear with me. On the events of November 23rd, 1963, on Saturday, November 23rd, the body of John F. Kennedy was taken to the East Room of the White House. And all that went on that day is from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m., family members and government dignitaries were allowed to pay their last respects to the fallen president. The events of November 24th, 1963, on Sunday, November 24th, there was scheduled to be a military processional, which is a parade, from the White House to the Capitol. At the Capitol, the president's body was to, quote, lay in state under the Capitol Rotunda for all Americans to honor until 8 p.m. that evening. So the Capitol Rotunda is obviously that big, what would you call it? Dome, yes, thank you, on the Capitol. And so he laid in state right underneath the dome inside the Capitol, which you'll get a chance to see as well. Well, here's what happens that day at 12:34 p.m. And what times are these? Time zone, Eastern, okay? At 12:34 p.m., Jackie and Robert Kennedy entered the East Room of the White House. This is the morning of the 24th, and the president's coffin was opened for them. And Mrs. Kennedy placed 5 items in the coffin. She placed a letter from herself. She placed a letter from her daughter, Caroline. She put in there a scribbled sheet of paper from John Kennedy Jr., a pair of gold cufflinks that belonged to the president, and a scrimshaw bearing the presidential seal. Does anybody know what a scrimshaw is? Here's a replica of one of the scrimshaws that President Kennedy had. They're usually bone or tooth with things etched into them. The one that she put in there was a scrimshaw with the presidential seal etched on it that she had given him. But this is what a scrimshaw was. The president was very fond of those. Okay, and again, that's a replica. Robert Kennedy then placed 2 items in the coffin. His PT 109 tie pin and an engraved silver rosary, which is a symbol of the Catholic Church. I'm going to tell you about this PT 109 pin. Here are 2. I'll pass these around. One is a PT boat. It's a tie clasp for your tie that says Kennedy 60. Those were the tie tacks that the president gave away when he ran for president in 1960. The bottom one simply just says Kennedy. And those were the ones that he was planning on using during what? The re-election campaign, which never occurred. So who used him in his run for president, which we'll talk about later? Bobby. So the top one was used in the election of 1960. The bottom one was supposed to be used in Kennedy's re-election campaign. Eventually were used in Bobby Kennedy's. Okay? You can look at those. But those are 2 things that Robert Kennedy placed into the coffin. His PT 109 tie pin and an engraved silver rosary. Now you heard this if you were paying attention to the movie The Kennedy Detail. You've already heard this story. According to Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who escorted Jackie and Robert to the White House, Mrs. Kennedy asked him to retrieve a pair of scissors. Hill retrieved the scissors for Jackie and stepped out of the room. Hill then later stated that he heard a clip from the area of the coffin. Then the coffin was closed, and Hill escorted Mrs. Kennedy and Robert from the East Room. And Hill later stated that he assumed that Mrs. Kennedy had taken a lock of the president's hair at that point. The president's coffin was closed. The casket was loaded on the horse-drawn caisson in front of the White House. And I will tell you, it's not on here, Mrs. Kennedy used the exact same protocol that was used for President Abraham Lincoln's funeral and the funeral of her husband, to the detail. Okay? Copied the funeral procession from the Lincoln burial to the T. At 1:08 p.m., the processional parade began from the White House to the Capitol. So the president's body is going to be paraded from the White House, where it's sitting in the East Room, to the Capitol, where it's going to lay in state. Okay? The processional was watched by hundreds of thousands of people that lined the route from the White House to the Capitol, and the parade reached the steps of Capitol Hill at 1:47 p.m. When we get done with this lecture, I'm going to show you this as it was shown on CBS News today. You'll get a chance to see it. At 1:52 p.m., a 21-gun salute was fired as the body bearers carried the casket up the stairs to the rotunda. Not an easy task. Okay, because if you've ever seen the stairs to the Capitol, which some of you have probably been there, if you've gone for history days or whatever, they're very steep and short, and the casket was very heavy. At 2:02 p.m. in the Capitol Rotunda, Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana gave his famous eulogy to the fallen president, which was entitled, "In a Moment, It Was No More." I'm going to take the time to read this to you, and I want you to think about the movie, and I told you to pay attention, okay? Here was Mansfield's eulogy. "There was a sound of laughter, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a wit in a man neither young nor old, but a wit full of an old man's wisdom and of a child's wisdom. Then, in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a man marked with scars of love of his country, a body active with the surge of life far, far from spent, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a father with a little boy and a little girl, and the joy of each and the other, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a husband who asked much and gave much, and out of the giving and the asking wove with a woman what could not be broken in life, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands and kissed him and closed the lid of a coffin. A piece of each of us died at that moment, yet in death he gave himself to us. He gave us of a good heart from which the laughter came. He gave us of a profound wit from which a great leadership emerged. He gave us of a kindness and strength fused into the human courage to seek peace without fear. He gave us of his life that we too in turn might give. He gave that we might give of ourselves, that we might give to one another until there would be no room at all for the bigotry, the hatred, prejudice, and the arrogance which converted in that moment of horror to strike him down. In leaving us these gifts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States, leaves with us. Will we take them, Mr. President? Will we have now the sense and the responsibility and the courage to take them? I pray to God that we will. One of the greatest eulogies in American history. I am so proud to say that I was a friend of Senator Mansfield, and here is a copy of the original eulogy with a letter that he sent to a Mrs. R.L. Irvin on December 4th, 1963, when she asked for a copy with his signature. Senator Mansfield and I were great friends. He was a great statesman. I wish you would have had the opportunity to meet him. He worked until the day he died in his mid-90s, and early in my career, when we went to Washington, D.C., he would meet with our kids. It was the greatest thrill ever. Well, after Mansfield's eulogy, Mrs. Kennedy and Caroline knelt by the coffin, and Mrs. Kennedy kisses the flag at 2:17 p.m. At 2:19 p.m., the Kennedy family left Capitol Hill, and people began to pay their respects to the fallen president. Now, what basically happened is people could come in and file into the rotunda until 8 p.m. that night to pay their respects. But officials decided to keep it open as long as people wanted to come. And to me, this is incredible. By 1 a.m. the next day, by 1 a.m. on Monday, November 25th, approximately 76,000 people had filed back by Kennedy's coffin at a rate of 14,400 per hour. It was at that point that officials adjusted their plan by having people go two abreast in each of the two lines past the casket. So instead of single file, they had so many people in line, they went 2 by 2. Okay? At 2 a.m. the next morning, the line on Capitol Hill to see the president's casket was 3 miles long. Can you imagine that? How far would it be 3 miles from the school to maybe the railroad tracks down by Warland Ford? How far would that even be 3 miles? Yeah, think about that. Just think about how long this line was. Okay? Well, finally, they had to close the doors of the Capitol at 10 a.m. the next morning because what were they preparing for? the funeral and the burial. So can you imagine that? It was estimated that over 250,000 people came to the rotunda to pay their respects to the fallen president that day. And that's basically what happened that day and into the next day. Okay? So we'll move on to November 25th, 1963, the burial of a president. Now this is kind of an interesting story because when the question of where Kennedy was going to be buried, it was Jackie that made the final decision. Most of Kennedy's family wanted him to be buried where? In Massachusetts, back at Hyannisport. But her decision was based on a visit that President Kennedy had taken to Arlington Cemetery the week before his assassination. He visited, and he went up to the Arlington House, where you'll get a chance to stand and see the same view, and he looked out upon the city of Washington, D.C. from the kind of the front door of the Arlington House, and he just marveled at that view. And it is an incredible view. You'll get a chance to see it. Well, the weekend after the assassination, Secret Service agent Clint Hill escorted Mrs. Kennedy back to Arlington. And it was then that she picked out the spot that the president would be buried. And if you're standing pretty much in the front steps of the Arlington House owned by Robert E. Lee, and you look right down the hill, that's where the president's buried. She buried him right at the bottom of that hill. And you'll get a chance to see that. But the view from there is absolutely incredible. So she chose that spot to be the final resting place for her husband. So on Monday, November 25th, John Fitzgerald Kennedy began his long journey to Arlington Cemetery. And where is the president's casket now? At the Capitol. So at 10:40 a.m., 40 minutes after they closed it down to the public to pay their last respects, Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy arrived at the Capitol and entered the rotunda. All three knelt and prayed at the casket, then slowly rose and left the rotunda. At 10:45 a.m., President Kennedy's casket was removed from the Capitol rotunda. It was taken down the steep steps of the Capitol by 8 chosen enlisted military men commanded by Samuel R. Byrd, George A. Barnum from the Coast Guard, Hubert Clark from the Navy, Timothy F. Cheek from the Marines, Richard E. Gaudreau from the Air Force, James L. Felder, African American, from the Army, Douglas A. Mayfield from the Army, Larry B. Smith from the Navy, and Jerry J. Diamond from the Marines. I have several, if you're interested, of the signatures of these particular casket bearers. I'm missing 2 out of the total. Okay, those were the casket bearers. They were the ones that carried the president's casket. The president's casket was very heavy, and the steps of the Capitol were steep to the caisson. The caisson is the horse-drawn caisson is where the casket's going to be put on. You'll see it in the video. Timothy Cheek, who was just 20 years old at the time, was quoted as saying, "I was in a trance. We were kids, totally focused on doing our duty as well as we could. My thought during my duty was, don't drop the casket, especially down the steep rotunda stairs. One falter and that casket was gone." Army Sergeant James L. Felder was quoted as saying, "This was the part we were all frightened of. We wet our gloves and prepared, took a grip. We got it down the steps, no problem, breathed a sigh of relief, and put it onto the caisson." It was a very, very heavy casket and very steep. Yep.
Is it the same casket that they got?
No, very good question. No, it was a different one. Okay, and it was heavy. And those guys, you can't show emotion, you can't show the strain, so you've got to be very professional. And they were very concerned because it was quite. You'll get a chance to see these steps if you can imagine carrying it down. Well, at 1:50 a.m., the processional began its journey to Arlington National Cemetery. In other words, they secured the president's coffin to the caisson. Behind the caisson, where the president's casket rested during the parade route, was Blackjack, the riderless horse with empty reversed boots to signify a fallen leader, used in the funeral of Abraham Lincoln. Okay? It was Private First Class Arthur Carlson, who was a 19-year-old member of the Old Guard, and the Old Guard are the people that guard the tomb of the unknown soldier, who led the prestigious horse throughout the parade route. Again, the Old Guard was an elite unit of soldiers who kept the eternal vigil over the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington. Now, here's a picture of Blackjack, and here's the signature of Arthur Carlson, and you'll see him in the video. that led that riderless horse. And he had his hands full, you can imagine. Well, this is what really was interesting. Mrs. Kennedy insisted on walking behind her husband's casket the entire funeral route, rather than ride an automobile. That was a long way. You'll get an idea what's that like when we get there, okay? And Robert and Edward Kennedy were not going to let her walk alone, so they joined her for the processional, which was of great concern to the Secret Service. This is an interesting statement. Not since the burial of the unknown soldier 40 years earlier at the tomb of the unknown soldier had there been so many foreign dignitaries in Washington, D.C. Every civilized country in the world was represented with the exception of China and Albania. They were the only two civilized countries in the world that did not send a representative to the Kennedy funeral. Now, what do you think these foreign dignitaries chose to do as well then? Join Mrs. Kennedy. And so can you imagine what kind of a nightmare that might have been for security for the Secret Service to have Charles de Gaulle there, the leader of France, walking behind Mrs. Kennedy, which he did, which you'll get a chance to see. Well, this is a great point of our trip to D.C. I hope you enjoy no matter what religious persuasion you are. At 12:14 p.m., the President's coffin entered St. Matthew's Cathedral on Connecticut Avenue, where the funeral mass would take place, and Archbishop Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston was the man that conducted the mass. And here's a picture of Richard Cardinal Cushing right here and a letter that he signed. He was the man chosen to do the Kennedy funeral mass. One of the 5 altar boys, if you're Catholic, how many Catholics in here? Okay, were you ever an altar boy? Shame on you. No. The altar boys are a big part of the service in the Catholic, or they used to be, maybe it's changed. But one of the, still the same? Yeah. One of the 5 altar boys at the Kennedy funeral mass was 12-year-old Reamur Donnelly. And he was a 7th grader at Calvert School in Washington, D.C. Calvert School is a parochial school that was attached to St. Matthew's Cathedral, wasn't far from the White House. And Reamur was probably chosen in part because of his father's long association with President Kennedy. His father had known President Kennedy since they were classmates at Harvard, and he became a doctor after medical school at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And ironically, Dr. Donnelly had treated John Kennedy and Jacqueline for about 10 years before Kennedy was elected president and had his own physician. And the younger Donnelly was later quoted 50 years later at the age of 62. He said, quote, "When you're 12 years old, you just think about how it affects you as a 12-year-old. And I guess I connected to the children and the wife. I just thought about the kids losing their father and the wife losing her husband and how sad that was." And here's a picture of Mr. Donnelly right here at the funeral mass and today, and a signature there. So, okay. At 1:21 p.m. following the mass, the body of the slain president was placed back on the caisson in front of St. Matthew's Cathedral. Family members were waiting on the steps as the casket was secured on the caisson. The band played "Hail to the Chief," and Mrs. Kennedy bent down and whispered into her young son's ear, John Kennedy Jr. John F. Kennedy Jr. then stood stiffly and gave a final tribute to his father, a salute. And David Powers was later quoted as saying, "We used to salute around the White House a lot. Heads of state used to come into the White House and John would be in the balcony even as a little boy and he'd see them all saluting. He was always great at saluting, except sometimes he would salute with his left hand. But on that day, he was perfect." Okay, I want you to turn to the handout that I gave you that says "Little Soldiers Salute." Okay, everybody pull that up. This came from the UPI on November 25th. "His world was strangely different. In little ways the child notices but does not understand. Where is his daddy? The tall man with the laughing blue eyes who had a big desk and saw lots of important people and stooped to spank him good-naturedly and took him on helicopter rides and called him John John. This was supposed to be the day of the party. The cake with 3 candles to blow out, the friends singing happy birthday, the gifts. But this day was different. The soldiers outside whose salutes he delighted in trying to return with one of his own looked different. They didn't glance down at him and sneak a wink or smile today. Their commands barked, their rifles clattered. They stood at the bottom of the steps. Pallbearers appeared at the door with the flag-draped casket. And as it came slowly toward them, Mrs. Kennedy leaned down and whispered to her son. He stood apart, straightened stiffly, and raised his hand in salute as the casket passed. A little boy at his grieving mother's side saluted the passing casket. And in that moment, he suddenly became the brave soldier his father would have wanted him to be on this day of all days. For today, John F. Kennedy Jr. turned 3. Buried his father on his 3rd birthday. That's a very iconic Pulitzer Prize winning photograph. Okay, let's turn to the next handout I gave you. I thought this was a great story here. Daily News iconic photo of JFK Jr.'s salute to Dad's coffin still haunts. Lifelong photography. Is that it? Holy moly, we'll finish tomorrow. I got excited. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow. We'll finish this up. Make sure you start working on those tests. Don't wait till the last moment, please.